Just have an honor to be apart from the keynote to open this conference, and it's quite stressful, so please be tolerant with me. I'm going to talk about historiography more than women photographers, because as we all know, what it takes to become a famous artist. So talent is an indispensable part of it. However, the world is full of talented artists who have never gained any or only very little recognition. Then that's why it's also necessary to have a friendly art dealer who believes in you and is willing to invest in you in order to introduce your work to a wider public. After all, being an artist is also a job, and that's the last discussion mentioned that. But there is at least one more vital element, a historian who would be able to write you into history books. After all, just a second, just kind of as a joke, what would we know about the great Michelangelo without Vasari? So, research, so now we are going to talk about photography, and one remark. Research of photography is such a broad and interdisciplinary field, interwoven with sociology, anthropology and other disciplines. And today I'm going to focus only on art history and study on photography within the discipline of art history. And with the emergence of the so-called social history in the 1970s, and later the social history of photography, we have come to understand that artistic activities is inseparable from its social, economic, and political context. Art reflects and is shaped by society. The same is true when we examine historiography. In my talk, I would like to focus on the conditions under which Polish historiography of photography has developed since 1970s, and in particular on the role of women in this process. I aim to demonstrate how social, political, and ideological circumstances have influenced the way these women perceive their place among scholars of art history, as well as the research attitudes they adopted. Research into the history of photography in Poland. I don't have many slides because it's quite theoretical talk, but I will have some. Research into the history of photography in Poland is still a relatively young field, but that is the case in many other countries as well. Its absorption into the broader discipline of art history began only in 1970s, during a transformation of the academic landscape influenced by neo-Marxist theorists. It was a moment of self-reflection across many disciplines, and art history was no exception. It came to be seen as a conservative discipline, idealizing while male artists and treating them as genius masters, a discipline compliant with bourgeoisie ideology. So photography, which was previously excluded from traditional academic research, in these new circumstances, fitted well into this critical re-evaluation. In Poland, back then, still under the communist regime, Polish scholars were aware of contemporary discussions in Western academia, but for various reasons, some of which I will discuss later, were very reluctant to adopt neo-Marxist theories. However, the international trend, what one Polish critic called admiration for retro photography, fell on fertile ground and found its most spectacular manifestation in the exhibition Polish Photography 1979, prepared in New York. The exhibition is altogether a story for another talk, as it was in fact not a Polish idea, but it was prepared and initiated in the United States. But as I speak out, there was a Polish woman quite recognized in New York that came up with the idea, but I have to research on that more. But anyway, this international exhibition and undeniably strengthened the interest in history of the medium in Poland. But of course, even before this, Polish photographers had already started to take an interest in the matter. In the 1970s, the Polish Association of Art Photographers established a history of photography committee and began advocating for the creation of a research institution dedicated to developing studies in the field, in fact not fulfilled till this day. It is not that there had been no interest in the history of photography before. The main articles on the subject regularly appeared in the monthly magazine Fotografia, the country's main photographic periodical. However, these short essays, aimed at the general public and based mostly on secondary sources, could not fill the existing void. It is also true that these articles will focus mainly on interwar avant-garde photography, and 19th century photography was generally left out. So the committee aimed to initiate archival research, preserve the archives of living photographers, and promote publication in the field. Ironically, although the committee was predominantly male, only 2 of its 10 board members were women. It was a woman, Aleksandra Garlicka, holding a position of its secretary, who took upon herself the daunting task of encouraging older generation photographers to write their memoirs, a task with the aim it was supposed to be a publication, the task never completed. More importantly, she conducted a survey aimed at identifying the most interesting and valuable photographs held by a Polish public institution. She dreamt of creating a central inventory of both public and private collections that would serve as a national archive of the history of photography. Unfortunately, a lack of sufficient funding prevented this from materializing. Here, my theory about her work is that while some of her colleagues before contributed to the field with some valuable publication, she was the first to initiate a meticulous and ungrateful job of spending long hours in the archive. So, a lot of work, not so much fame. Nonetheless, the outcome of her effort was a series of 23 articles devoted to various public institutions, published in Fotografia between 1979 and 1989. This project was one of the first serious attempts to draw attention to photographic resources in Polish public collections, materials that had often been overlooked and at best treated as iconographic content, valuable only for the image itself, not a physical object of historical importance. This experience allowed Garlicka to fully grasp the significance of a chance discovery in the attic of her newly purchased cottage. Around the turn of 1970s and 1980s, she came across old family photographs left by the previous owners. At that time, she was already well aware that images of peasants were not represented in Polish public collections, and, more importantly, that very few people were even aware of their existence. This discovery led to a series of large-scale exhibitions devoted to various social classes: peasants, 1985, workers, and this is the photo from the workers, 1989, and Intelligentsia, 1995. What's important is that this exhibition was held in Zachęta, so the most important Polish art gallery. This exhibition consisted of hundreds of pre-war photographs sent by individuals who chose to share their family stories and private collection with the public. This exhibition significantly enriched our understanding of historical everyday practices in Poland. However, Garlicka has been largely written out of the history of Polish photography. Not many people know about this exhibition, and the situation has only started to change in recent years. Now, I will also want to introduce one more woman that was my supervisor of my PhD, Wanda Mossakowska. And it was in fact her story that inspired me to explore the contribution of women to the development of photography historiography in Poland. Wanda began her journey with photography in the late 1970s. She was married to a young art historian, Stanisław Mossakowski, who was soon to become one of the most prominent figures in the field of serious art history. Wanda herself took on various part-time jobs, including working as an assistant for Polish radio. And then she met Juliusz Gazdecki, a man who left a lasting impression on her. That's the whole story of her admiration for Gazdecki, who was initially head of this, what I mentioned, History of Photography Committee, and was a significant figure in photographic circles at the time. Wanda recalls this encounter inspired her to choose a topic for her PhD, history of photography, something her inner circle had encouraged her to do for some time. She had previously been reluctant, as she didn't feel competent enough to compete in the field of classical, what I mean, like serious Baroque, Renaissance art history, especially alongside her husband, whom she deeply admired. She chose instead to focus on history of photography, a field then largely unexplored and overlooked by mainstream scholars. Her doctoral research centered on Walery Rzewuski. That is the book published based on her PhD. One of the most important Polish photographers of the 19th century. Mossakowska is modest when talking about her ambitions back then. The fact is, however, that she went on to author several important works, including a guide in Polish collection, a guide to daguerreotypes in Polish collections, the history of photography in Warsaw, 1939-1963. For the latter, she was awarded a habilitation, and to this day, her writings remain one of the most important sources for scholars in the field. While Mossakowska represented academic circles, Krystyna Lejko was an art historian working within a museum context. She was a curator at the Museum of Warsaw, and she also cited another male journalist and amateur art historian as an inspiration. But unlike Żdarski, but in line with Garlicka and Mossakowska work, Lejko engaged in a very thorough research, which culminated in the 1978 exhibition Old Photographs of Warsaw, 1850-1914. And this catalog, the book which accompanied the exhibition, included a list of all photographic studios, the first of its kind and very useful to this day. Interestingly, none of these women I've mentioned chose to focus on female photographers or to include them significantly in their research. Krystyna Lejko was an exception when her article on pioneering female photographers in 19th century Warsaw, that's the article. However, according to her own words, she treated it as a minor contribution, a historical curiosity rather than a meaningful area of study. To advance her professional career, she chose instead to focus on Konrad Brandl, another prominent 19th century male photographer. Her monograph on Brandl, published in 1985, established her as one of the leading specialists in the field. I'm sorry because just have to control the clock. I have been fortunate enough to interview two of these pioneering women, Wanda Mossakowska, now 87, and Krystyna Lejko, now 93. I also spoke with Barbara Kosińska, who was part of the editorial board for Fotografia in the 1970s and 1980s and generously shared her extensive knowledge of the field. What struck me most in this conversation was how skeptical all three were about the very premise of my research. They firmly rejected the idea that they could be described as feminists. Not that I even suggested that, it was just the immediate research, so please treat us as art historians, not female art historians. They also emphasize that the only reason women were among the first to engage in history of photography was simply that over the time the discipline had become predominantly female. Just an anecdote, I can say that Wanda, whose husband is a really prominent art historian, mentioned to me that her husband has never read anything she has written, because she's not interested in this kind of nonsense. It's not about women, it's about photography, so how still in this older generations, photography is considered as less important than some Renaissance great art. I want to challenge this point, and let's start with the question of feminism. As we all here today come from different backgrounds, some of us represent so-called Western academia, many come from countries that shared with Poland the experience of communism, and others come from regions with histories quite distinct from that of Europe. But it is important to acknowledge that feminist idea originated in the West and later circulated to Eastern Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. However, as Polish scholar Agata Jakubowska has shown, this was not a simple process of diffusion and absorption. In each case, feminist idea clashed with distinct political, historical, and cultural contexts. In the case of Poland, one of the most crucial elements to consider is the tension between the state socialist project aiming at the emancipation of women and the second wave of feminism. In short, the politics of women's emancipation were implemented in Poland just after the Second World War, when gender equality was considered a foundation of the newly established social order. Women were granted equal rights to men, allowed to work in all fields, and strongly encouraged to do so. It might have seemed that many of the demands later formulated by second-wave feminists in the 1960s had already been fulfilled in Poland a decade earlier. However, it was also clear that these policies were part of the ruling party's propaganda. Some researchers argue that women's activism in socialist Poland should be seen as instrumental to the regime, as it depended on cooperation with the government and merely responded to state policies. As a result, many artists and scholars refrain from engaging in women's politics, which they perceive as being associated with the totalitarian regime. Moreover, since 1960s, there has been a persistent belief within Polish intellectual circles that they should maintain a critical and anti-communist stance, which led to the rejection of critical frameworks such as feminism. Another important point is that although after 1945 more and more women enter academia or work in museums, they rarely held senior or managerial positions. I haven't come across exact figures, though that doesn't mean they don't exist, but it feels that their male colleagues were the ones who set the direction and, crucially, controlled the funding. The dominant direction, as another scholar, Karolina Łabowicz-Dymanos, has recently shown, adhere to notions of objective and apolitical science, perpetuating earlier methodologies based on a factographic objective approach. Furthermore, it's important to acknowledge that scholars such as Mossakowska, Lejko, and Garlicka came from the pre-war intelligentsia and, to some extent, found a form of exile in art history. In short, they live in something of a bubble. Although they took an interest in photography, which could be seen as somewhat revolutionary, they were not eager to challenge existing methodologies. We need to remember that the field was predominantly dominated by a relatively homogeneous intellectual elite that historically shaped the narrative to reflect their own cultural codes, political beliefs, and social standings, often deliberately omitting the diverse and dynamic elements of Polish art history. In order to gain recognition and respect among the senior male colleagues, these women I was talking about aimed to prove that photography could be a legitimate subject of research for art historians. To this end, they chose to focus on male photographers who had already been recognized as masters in the field, identify their best work, and integrate them into existing research frameworks. And that was, in fact, the situation just until the fall of the communism, which deeply affected Polish culture and led to profound changes in the way it was founded. While we tend to view the 1980s as a time of deep economic crisis, the government was still more willing to invest in cultural activities than after 1989. This shift led to visible decline in academic research, which deeply affected photographic studies, a field still perceived as secondary within art history. And as I don't have much time, it took longer than I expected. I just wanted to say that the situation began to change only in 2000s, particularly with Poland's accession to the European Union, when a new generation of scholars, born in the late 1970s and 1980s, entered the scene. Raised and educated in a more democratic and liberal environment, with freer access to Western publication and opportunities for intellectual exchange with their Western peers, they adopted more inclusive and critically engaged approaches. And here there are some examples. I missed the slide. So this was about Poland after the war and how we included women in all my works. Yes, I'm just about to finish. I just wanted to mention a few exhibitions this time. The breakthrough was 2008, prepared by Karolina Lewandowska, and that was the first exhibition. This was the first exhibition, result of research conducted by Karolina, which introduced a work of 50 female photographers from the 20th century, and is widely seen as opening up a debate about the canon. And it was seen as a breakthrough. The results didn't come immediately, and the next one, that followed that path, was only in 2019 with Katarzyna Gębarowska, who is probably someone there, with her exhibition Eros and Thanatos, female pioneers in professional photography in Bydgoszcz. And that paved the way for further research in the activity of female photographers, particularly those working outside Poland's main cultural centers, because they were excluded not only as female, but also the one that didn't operate in Warsaw, Kraków, or any of the other big Polish cities. There was also an exhibition in 2022 about the untold stories of Polish female photographers. And also there is Archeologia Photography Foundation, established by Lewandowska, so the one that came with the idea of 208 exhibition, with the mission to study and preserve the archive of Polish photographers. And currently 3 of archives they have in their portfolio are those of 3 of 10 are those of female photographers. And in recent years, despite limited resources, as this is NGO, it has gone to great lengths to research and promote the work of Polish female photographers, most notably Anna Mosiałówna and more recently Danuta Rago. There was also in Museum of Warsaw, directed by Lewandowska again, so Lewandowska come out here in the recent years as the main figures, has also incorporated photography into its strategic priorities, faithful also to her mission to promote women. And one of the outcomes was 2022 exhibition curated by Antonina Gugała, who should be somewhere here. I don't know if she's here, but should be. Devoted to a studio photographer, Selina Osiecka, and her analog photographic services that she has been offering to her clients since 1960s. The exhibition and the accompanying books give a rare insight into the work and life of this photographer, and there was a unique attempt to put an artisan female photographer in the spotlight. All in all, the work of to write female photographers into the wider context of Polish history of photography is still work in progress. As we see, despite the fact that over the last 5 decades it was mostly women who focused on history of the medium, only relatively recently, changes in Polish academia and gradual adoption of more inclusive and critically engaged approach enable more in-depth studies on photography in general. Female photographers seem to finally find a place on the history books. Thank you. And sorry.